Hey, what's up everybody, it's Lids, and we're back for some more Gwent, and today we're taking a look at the new Skellige cards revealed for the new The Tide Rises expansion coming out July 11th. There will be 6 new cards for every faction, not including neutrals. Let's start with the new Skellige common card, Funeral Boat, which is a 4-power, 4-provision machine ship. Whenever a card enters either graveyard, damage a random enemy unit by 1. That means that this is an engine because it can supply you with consistent damage, and I think it's pretty easy to underestimate just how much that damage can add up, because the obvious way to get damage here is by destroying one of your opponent's units with damage. However, it doesn't have to be a unit going into the graveyard to trigger the Funeral Boat. Special cards count too, and because those automatically go into the graveyard as soon as they get played, that gives you an easy way to get at least 1 damage, and if that special card deals enough damage to remove one of your opponent's units, then that's a second card going into the graveyard in 1 turn, giving you 2 damage. Not only that, Funeral Boat can also deal damage to your opponent on their turn, because it activates when a card goes into either player's graveyard. So if your opponent plays a special card, they're getting damaged by 1. If your opponent destroys one of your units, then they're getting damaged by 1. You could even combine this with Discard Package or Blaze of Glory for even more damage, though Blaze of Glory is probably overkill. So that actually makes Funeral Boat's ability very interesting and unique, potentially adding up to quite a bit of damage. The downside is, at just 4 power, it's pretty easy for your opponent to answer it and underestimate it. This card is very versatile. In fact, you could make a case that it's best in raids decks because you're playing a lot of special cards, so that means you're getting at least 1 point of damage from doing that when the special card goes into your graveyard, and if that special card destroys one of your opponent's units, that's another point of damage from Funeral Boat, giving you potentially 2 points of damage per turn, possibly even more if your opponent is playing specials or using a damage deck, if you can keep Funeral Boat on the board. But if you're concerned about Funeral Boat getting destroyed, you could use it in an Onslaught deck and keep it in your hand for a little while, where it will gain armor anytime one of your opponent's units becomes damaged. That's certainly safer. The downside to that is because Funeral Boat is an engine, you'd usually want to play it very early in a round, which means you wouldn't have as much time to get armor on Funeral Boat, so even if you do use it in an Onslaught deck, you're still going to have to compromise on either damage or armor. But if you can keep Funeral Boat alive, it could give you incredible value for just 4 provisions, so I think this card will be a big deal. Next, we have the new Skellige rare card, Boardage, which is a 6-provision raid that damages an enemy unit by 2, and if you have 2 damage units on your opponent's side of the board, you can play a pirate from your hand and then draw a card. Now, at first glance, you probably look at this and say to yourself, 2 damage for 6 provisions might make this the worst card in the game. And if you aren't at that Bloodthirst 2 threshold, then that might be the case. But if you do have Bloodthirst 2, then you can basically think of this as paying 6 provisions to play a pirate that you were already going to play, while getting 2 extra damage and getting a little bit of thinning on the same turn. That's still a little hard to contextualize how valuable that is, because most bronze cards that thin 1 card from your deck are the various 5-provision units that conditionally summon out an extra copy of them from your deck. Like, for example, Drummond Shield Maiden, Crow Messenger, and Anglerfish. Helmar Scald is the other bronze Skellige thinning option that draws and discards a card from your hand. But a Boardage still feels very different from those cards because those are all units, and none of those cards have Bloodthirst as the condition. Those differences make it hard to gauge just how valuable Boardage is, especially because it costs more than all of those alternatives. It is, however, the only Skellige card that can draw a card without needing to discard a card. Obviously, you'd want to use it in a deck that uses a bunch of pirates, so that means probably Onslaught. Otherwise, even if you do have Bloodthirst 2, you still won't be able to play a pirate. And remember, that pirate could be either a gold or a bronze. And because you're starting off with that 2 damage, if you combine that with the ability of the pirate that you play, then that might give you just enough damage to remove something that would have otherwise been out of range. That, and if you use this in more of a raid deck with a Highland Warlord, then of course you could increase the damage, and although it would likely take you several Warlords before you'd have enough damage directly from a Boardage to remove a unit, combining higher damage from a Boardage with whatever damage you get from that pirate might help you remove a big card. But unlike with the Warlord Primal Savagery combo, there's no Deathblow ability that we're trying to set up here. Overall, I'm still kinda skeptical. It might not be the worst card, but it also looks pretty far from being one of the best. Unless maybe if you desperately needed 1 or 2 more thinning in your deck to set up Magic Compass. Next, we have the first of the new Skellige epic cards, Naval Supremacy, which is an 8-provision special raid. It creates and plays a bronze Skellige ship, and while in graveyard, whenever a unit is played, damage it by 1. After 13 damage has been dealt, banish self. So like any other create ability, that means you should see 3 bronze Skellige ships to choose from, and with this expansion, you'll have 7 eligible cards that might show up. Uncrate Longship possibly being the preferred option, but Funeral Boat could be very good as well. Then after playing Naval Supremacy, whenever either you or your opponent plays a unit, it will get damaged by 1. Now that may seem like net neutral value, but there are a couple ways to turn that into maybe 6 or 7 points of damage. One is that if you're using Naval Supremacy in an onslaught deck, that means that you should be getting lots of armor whenever you damage one of your opponent's units, so whatever units you play should be able to absorb that damage from Naval Supremacy, whereas when your opponent plays a card, their unit is much more likely to actually get damaged, which is also a nice way to set up even more armor on your ships and pirates in your hand. In that case, Naval Supremacy probably gives you about 6 or 7 points of damage while it's in your graveyard. The other approach, which is a little more extreme, is to use Naval Supremacy in a raids deck, where if on most of your turns you're playing raids, not units, that means that you won't waste some Naval Supremacy charges on yourself, and instead you're saving all of those for your opponent's units. Obviously, you still need to have at least 13 units in your deck, so at some point you'll probably end up damaging your own units with Naval Supremacy, and you won't have the extra armor from Onslaught to shake it off. But if your opponent is playing units twice as often as you are, then that may be even better than using Naval Supremacy in a pure pirates and ships deck. Though I suppose there's nothing stopping you from using raids in an onslaught deck. Either way, you're going to want to play this early in the match so that you have time for all that damage to trigger. Fortunately, most Bronze Skellige ships are engines, so that should help make playing Naval Supremacy a little bit smoother. That, and as long as your opponent doesn't remove Naval Supremacy from your graveyard with a Squirrel or Xavier, then playing it in round 1 or round 2 could give you some unique carryover damage in later rounds. Next, we have the second Skellige epic card, Justiana Uncrate, who's a 6 power, 1 armor, 10 provision human pirate. She has a veteran ability, which means in round 2 and round 3 she'll increase her base power by 1, and you can increase her base power by an additional point if you play her in the same deck as King Bran. Her deploy ability damages herself by her own base power, then splits as much damage randomly between all enemy units. That's almost the same as Clash, except instead of targeting one unit with Justiana's damage, instead it spreads out her damage randomly across all of your opponent's cards. That means that, much like with Clash cards, you want to find a way to mitigate her self-damage to maximize her value. Because if you play her on, say, the first turn of the entire match, then she'll damage herself by 6, and she'll survive with only 1 power because she has that 1 armor. That means you'll deal 6 damage and get a 1 power unit for 10 provisions, which is bad value. But that's the worst case scenario. If you play her in an onslaught deck and you have her in your hand, whenever one of your opponent's units gets damaged, Justiana will gain 1 armor, which means by the end of the match, she may have more armor than she has base power. That means even with her self-damaging deploy ability, she may be able to absorb most, if not all of the damage that she would deal to herself, meaning that she'll survive as an 8 or 9 base power card and split 8 or 9 damage randomly across all of your opponent's units, giving you roughly 16 to 18 points of value. And that is very good value. You could even play her next to Sucrus, who's also a pirate, for similar self-damage mitigation. That's a very similar effect and setup to what we saw a few days ago with Monster's new Lord Riptide card, though in this case, Lord Riptide has a little more base power, but always targets a specific unit and doesn't have nearly as many synergies with other Monsters cards as Justiana has for Skellige decks. That's because Justiana can support some powerful Skellige engines like Dogger. I'm still not sure that warrants having her cost 2 more provisions, but she's almost like a stronger Skjordal, and he costs 8 provisions, so maybe the provision cost is still justified. Then we have the first of the new Skellige legendary cards, Care Trolda, a 9 provision artifact location with resilience. On deploy, you'll create and play a bronze Uncrate unit, which like we said before, means you'll have 3 options to choose from. There are 8 eligible cards, most of which are warriors who either deal damage or get boosted when you deal damage. Then you have an order to give an allied unit 6 armor, and then have that unit clash with an enemy unit. Skellige does already have several clashing cards, Croc probably having the most similar effect, because he also gives you some flexibility to choose which card does the clashing. You'd ideally use this on one of your stronger cards. Bear in mind that this could be one of your bronze or gold units that you choose, so you could have a lot of range with that clash. And because you also get that 6 armor, if you're going after one of your opponent's relatively small units, like say an engine before it's gotten lots of boosts, then you should be able to destroy your opponent's unit without damaging your own. But you could still go after one of your opponent's bigger cards, and at least mitigate a lot of the damage that your unit would take in the process, which could especially be worth doing if you destroy your opponent's unit just before it's about to gain additional value. You could also use this in an onslaught deck where you get a bunch of armor, and then not worry at all about your unit taking damage. Or, like with Justiana, you could combine this with Sucrus and completely ignore the self-damage. Overall, this doesn't look as big as many of the other locations that we've seen in the past, past, but at just 9 provisions, Caertrolda is a lot cheaper than many other locations, so that's not really a fair comparison. But I'm glad that we finally got this card, because I think this might have been the biggest thing from the Witcher world that we had yet to see in Gwent. One other relevant balance change to consider is that the Uncrate Armorsmith is getting completely reworked. He'll remain a 2-power unit, with his provisions increased from 4 to 5, but now he'll have a deploy ability to boost an allied unit by the amount of armor on the highest armor unit in your hand. That means we'll have another card to use in Onslaught decks that benefits when you develop lots of armor on units in your hand. However, there may now be so many of those types of cards that you won't be able to save them all until the end of the game. That means that although Uncrate Armorsmith might be best at the end of round 3, you might have to compromise a bit and use him as a round 1 or 2 finisher instead. That's why he could be a great choice for the Caertrolda deploy ability. Then finally, we have the last Skellige legendary card, Helmar Sea Wolf, which is a 10 base power, 14 provision human warrior pirate. On deploy, if you play him in the melee row, he will clash with an enemy unit. Whenever you play a raid, you'll remove all armor from Helmar and adjacent pirates and ships, then boost those units by the amount of armor that you remove. Obviously, this means Skellige is getting another clashing card, and with 10 base power, Helmar definitely could remove something big. But once again, to avoid having Helmar take a lot of damage himself, you're probably going to want to use him in Onslaught decks to build up his armor and keep him on the board even after he does that clash. Sucrus, once again, being another great way to do that. That's especially important because Helmar is an engine, turning armor into points whenever you play a raid card. That's almost like a higher tempo Dimmen Corsair, but it's more difficult to trigger. Basically, you want to save Helmar until late in the game, giving him lots of time to gain armor, so much that maybe he still has armor even after his clash. Then you play other pirates and ships with lots of armor next to him, and play a raid card to transform that armor into boosts. And if you have lots of units that still have tons of armor, you can then continue to play those units next to Helmar, and once again play a raid card to transform their armor into boosts. In that way, he'll play kind of similarly to Croc, in that you want to keep on playing more units next to him, like father, like son. Of course, the value there will vary a lot depending on just how much armor you do have remaining on those units, but if you've made a point of doing that, Helmar could give you a point slam, hull removal, and an engine, all in one card, which is amazing. But at 14 provisions, he better be amazing, otherwise he's not going to be worth it. Compare that to another card we were talking about recently with Nilfgaard's new Admiral Rumpali, who we were also saying can be an engine, point slam, and control card. With that value in so many different circumstances, I was saying this guy might break the game. But I don't necessarily think that will be the case with Helmar. Yes, he has higher base power, but he does cost 2 more provisions, and he requires a lot more setup, because if you don't have a lot of armor on him and other cards in your hand, then he'll be worth way less. Though to be fair, I'd probably still argue that both of these guys have too many abilities for one card. Similarly to Funeral Boat and Naval Supremacy, Helmar is also interesting in that he creates more overlap between the Pirates and Raids archetypes, because to get the full value from Helmar, you'll need at least 1 raid, but having 2 or 3 in hand so that you can activate Helmar's engine ability multiple times on several different units would probably be even better. So overall, the new Skellige cards focus on revitalizing the Pirates archetype, while also creating some new synergies with the Raids archetype. So what do you think about the new cards? Would you use them in a pure Pirates and ships deck? Or would you add more raid cards in addition to a Boardage and Naval Supremacy? Let me know what you think. Thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you next time.